The most expensive mistake a billionaire can make is believing the quietest person in the room has the least power. At exactly 4:22 on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the executive boardroom on the 43rd floor of Kensington Dynamics fell silent. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Seattle disappeared behind sheets of gray rain. But inside the glass conference room, 32 department heads watched something far more dangerous unfold. Charlotte Kensington, the 37-year-old billionaire who had transformed her father's manufacturing company into one of the fastest-growing technology firms in America, stood at the head of the polished walnut table with both hands resting firmly on a stack of reports. Her voice remained calm, but the disappointment behind it carried farther than shouting ever could. "If you believe this company cannot move forward without you," she said, locking eyes with Ethan Walker, "then prove it. Quit." No one moved. No one even reached for a notebook. Ethan sat quietly near the end of the table, wearing the same navy dress shirt he had rolled up at the sleeves during long engineering reviews for years. A faded photograph of his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, rested beside a worn leather notebook filled with handwritten diagrams. Victor Shaw leaned back comfortably in his chair, almost pleased with the direction the meeting had taken. For weeks, he had insisted Ethan was slowing the Orion automation project by refusing to approve the final safety certification. Every delay, Victor claimed, was costing the company millions of dollars. Charlotte had finally reached her limit. Ethan looked down at his watch. 4:22. Then he looked back at Charlotte with an expression so calm it unsettled several people around the table. "All right," he answered softly. 2 simple words. No anger. No argument. No attempt to defend himself. He reached beneath his desk and unfolded a flat cardboard box that had apparently been waiting there for days. The sound of the cardboard locking into place echoed through the silent room. One by one, he placed his belongings inside. First came the framed photograph of Lily smiling beside a science fair display built from colorful building blocks. Then the leather notebook. Then a ceramic coffee mug with tiny fingerprints painted around the rim and the words "World's Best Dad" written in uneven blue letters. Several managers exchanged confused glances. This was not how workplace confrontations usually ended. Victor allowed himself a small smile. Charlotte crossed her arms, expecting Ethan to stop, apologize, or negotiate. He did none of those things. He unplugged his company laptop, neatly wrapped the charging cable, and laid his employee identification badge on the conference table. Across the room, Diane Foster, the company's general counsel, had been quietly reviewing the Orion contract on her tablet while the meeting unfolded. She barely looked up until she noticed Ethan packing the notebook. Her eyes returned to the screen. She scrolled rapidly through several pages before suddenly freezing. The color drained from her face. She read one paragraph again, then a third time, as if hoping the words would somehow change. They did not. Diane slowly stood from her chair. "Charlotte," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do not let him walk out of this building." Every head turned toward her. Charlotte frowned. "Why?" Diane swallowed hard. "Because if Ethan Walker resigns today, Section 12 automatically suspends certification on Orion for 72 hours. Every client delivery stops. Every federal compliance review starts over. And according to the licensing agreement." She looked directly at Ethan, who quietly closed the lid of the cardboard box before lifting it into his arms. "He is the only designated systems architect authorized to complete the final validation." The room remained completely still. Rain continued striking the windows. Nobody spoke. Charlotte stared at the man she had just challenged to leave, and for the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she realized she had no idea who was actually holding the future of her company. Ethan Walker did not leave the building immediately. He simply carried the cardboard box through the quiet hallway while every employee who passed him instinctively stepped aside. Nobody knew exactly what had happened inside the executive boardroom, but people recognized the look on his face. It was not anger. It was not defeat. It was the calm expression of someone who had already accepted a difficult decision long before anyone else realized it had been made. 6 weeks earlier, every weekday in Ethan's life had begun at exactly 5:30 in the morning. Before the sun reached the rooftops of Seattle, he was already standing in a small kitchen making blueberry pancakes because Lily insisted they tasted better on school days than cereal ever could. While the pancakes cooked, Ethan packed her lunch with careful routine, sliced apples, peanut butter sandwiches, and a handwritten note folded neatly beside a small chocolate square. Every morning ended the same way. Lily smiled after reading the note, even though she already knew what it would say. Have a brave day. Love, Dad. By 6:45, they were driving 18 miles across the city. Lily sat in the back seat explaining the newest robot she wanted to build from colorful construction bricks, while Ethan listened with complete attention. She never competed with a ringing telephone because he kept his work phone on silent during those drives. She never wondered whether he was listening because he always was. After dropping Lily at school, Ethan arrived at Kensington Dynamics before almost everyone else. Most employees believed the building simply worked. Elevators moved. Production lines stayed synchronized. Automated inspection systems rarely failed. What they did not know was that Ethan quietly solved dozens of small problems before the first executive meeting ever began. He corrected software conflicts before alarms sounded. He rewrote unstable automation routines during his lunch break. When younger engineers struggled, he explained complicated systems without making anyone feel embarrassed. Whenever a manager praised him publicly, Ethan redirected the credit toward his team. He believed the strongest leaders left other people standing taller than before. At exactly 5:15 every afternoon, however, Ethan closed his laptop regardless of how busy the office appeared. Some managers whispered that he lacked ambition. Others joked that nobody serious about becoming a vice president watched the clock so closely. Victor Shaw encouraged those conversations whenever he could. Real leaders stay until the work is finished, he often said loud enough for others to hear. Ethan never answered. At 5:16, he was already walking toward the parking garage because Lily's after-school learning center closed at 6 o'clock sharp, and the drive across afternoon traffic usually took 40 minutes. One rainy evening, traffic slowed almost to a stop after an accident blocked 2 lanes. Ethan glanced at the dashboard clock every few seconds, but never reached for his phone while driving. He arrived with only 3 minutes remaining before closing. Lily ran toward him carrying a backpack almost larger than she was. "I knew you would come," she said with complete confidence. Ethan smiled as he helped her into the truck. "I promised." On the drive home, she asked the same question she had asked many times before. "Dad, why do you always leave work at the exact same time even when everybody else stays?" Ethan looked ahead at the wet highway reflecting hundreds of headlights. "Because companies can replace employees," he answered gently. "But little girls only get one father." Lily nodded as though the answer explained everything. In many ways, it did. Neither of them knew that the promise Ethan protected every evening would soon become the very reason someone powerful believed he did not care enough about his career. Charlotte Kensington had spent her entire adult life proving that inheriting a company did not mean inheriting respect. At 37 years old, she had become one of the youngest billionaire chief executive officers in the country, leading Kensington Dynamics from a respected manufacturing business into a global leader in industrial automation. Business magazines praised her bold decisions. Investors admired her discipline. Competitors feared her willingness to move faster than anyone else. Yet every quarterly board meeting reminded her that success had not completely silenced the people who believed she had simply been born into opportunity. Several board members still compared every decision she made to the leadership of her late father. They never raised their voices. They never needed to. A single sentence such as, "Your father would have handled this differently," was enough to stay with Charlotte long after the meeting ended. She rarely spoke about him, but there was one conversation she remembered with perfect clarity. Just weeks before his passing, he had stood beside the factory floor watching hundreds of robotic arms move in perfect synchronization. Without looking away from the production line, he quietly told her, "Never confuse the person who presents the reports with the person who truly understands the machines. Those are almost never the same person." At the time, Charlotte believed he was simply offering another leadership lesson. Years later, she still did not realize he had been warning her about something far more specific. Since becoming chief executive officer, Charlotte depended heavily on Victor Shaw, the company's experienced chief operating officer. Victor had worked beside her father for nearly 2 decades. He always arrived early, always carried organized reports, and always had immediate answers prepared before anyone asked difficult questions. Whenever projects slipped behind schedule, Victor already knew who was responsible. Whenever production targets were missed, he already had charts explaining why. To Charlotte, his confidence looked like experience. To everyone else, questioning Victor felt almost impossible because he controlled nearly every operational report reaching the executive floor. During the weeks leading up to the Orion certification meeting, Victor quietly shaped a single narrative. Ethan Walker, he insisted, had become the company's greatest obstacle. He refuses overtime whenever we need him most, Victor explained during one executive briefing. He insists on delaying safety approval over issues no client will ever notice. Another afternoon, he added, the engineering team spends more time waiting for Ethan than actually building anything. Charlotte listened carefully. The numbers appeared convincing. Missed milestones, delayed certifications, increasing project costs. Every presentation pointed toward the same conclusion. Ethan had become too comfortable believing the company depended entirely on him. Charlotte had rarely spoken with Ethan outside technical reviews. She knew he was respected by engineers. She knew he always left the office shortly after 5 in the afternoon. She also noticed he never attended executive dinners, networking events, or weekend planning sessions. From her perspective, his behavior looked distant, almost indifferent. She never saw the 18-mile drive across Seattle. She never saw Lily waiting by the classroom window every evening. She never saw the handwritten lunch notes or the promises Ethan quietly kept after everyone else left the office. She only saw the reports placed before her, and every one of them suggested the same troubling conclusion. When Victor finally recommended forcing Ethan to choose between complete loyalty to the company and his personal schedule, Charlotte believed she was protecting the future of Kensington Dynamics. She did not realize she had already accepted a carefully constructed story while overlooking the one person who had never once tried to defend himself. The Monday after Victor's presentation, a new policy appeared in every employee's inbox before 8 o'clock. Mandatory executive support hours. All senior engineering leaders would remain available until at least 8:30 in the evening whenever Orion entered a critical development phase. There were no exceptions listed. No mention of family responsibilities. No flexibility. Ethan read the message once, then quietly returned to reviewing safety logs from the overnight system tests. Around him, several engineers exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew who the policy was really aimed at. Ethan had always left at 5:15. Everyone on the engineering floor knew why. Victor walked through the department an hour later with the satisfied confidence of someone who had already predicted the outcome. He stopped beside Ethan's desk. "I trust you have seen the new expectations," he said. Ethan nodded. "I have." "Good. Orion comes before personal schedules." Ethan looked up calmly. "Safety comes before schedules." Victor smiled politely, but there was no warmth behind it. That attitude is exactly why this project keeps falling behind. Ethan offered no argument. After Victor walked away, one of the younger engineers leaned closer. "Are you going to say something?" Ethan returned to the technical drawings spread across his desk. "The machines do not care who wins an argument," he answered quietly. "They only care whether the numbers are correct." Later that afternoon, Ethan continued reviewing the latest validation reports before signing the final certification package. Something caught his attention. The system efficiency numbers looked unusually clean. Too clean. Industrial automation rarely produced perfect consistency across multiple stress simulations. He opened the previous test archive and compared the results line by line. The timestamps matched. The project identification numbers matched, but several performance values had changed. Tiny adjustments, less than 1%, enough to make unstable systems appear fully compliant. Ethan did not alert anyone immediately. Instead, he opened his handwritten notebook and carefully copied every conflicting value into the margin beside the original calculations. He quietly saved duplicate reports onto an encrypted drive before locking it inside his desk drawer. Across the city, Lily sat at the after-school learning center building another railroad model for her science project. That evening, she waited patiently at Ethan's office because her classroom had closed early for teacher conferences. She spread colored pencils across a conference table while Ethan finished comparing printed diagrams. After several minutes, she held up 2 pages. "Dad." Ethan looked over. "What is it?" Lily placed the papers side by side. "These trains have the same number, but this one arrives earlier." Ethan walked over and studied the pages. She was right. The shipment identification code was identical, yet the recorded completion time differed by 17 minutes. It was exactly the kind of inconsistency most adults ignored because the pages appeared nearly identical at first glance. Ethan slowly folded both reports and placed them inside his notebook. "Good catch," he said with a gentle smile. "How did you notice?" Lily shrugged. The lines looked the same, but the clock did not. Ethan looked at his daughter for a long moment. Sometimes fresh eyes saw what experience overlooked. The next morning, he requested access to the server audit history. The system showed one unexpected administrator login at 2:13 in the morning. On the same date, the numbers had changed. The account belonged to Victor Shaw. Ethan quietly closed the screen without saying a word. He still did not know why the data had been altered, but he now knew one thing with absolute certainty. The problem threatening Orion had never been inside the machines. It had been sitting inside the executive offices all along. At exactly 4:45 that Thursday afternoon, the executive conference room filled once again. The rain outside had not stopped, and neither had the pressure surrounding the Orion project. Every department head sat in the same chair as before, but the atmosphere felt noticeably heavier. Charlotte Kensington stood beside the presentation screen while Victor Shaw confidently addressed the room. Slide after slide appeared, each one carefully organized to tell a simple story. Deadlines had slipped. Costs had increased. Certification remained incomplete. Every chart pointed toward one conclusion. Victor paused dramatically before saying, "The Orion project has reached this point because one individual continues refusing to sign the final approval." His eyes shifted toward Ethan Walker. Several executives followed his gaze. Charlotte folded her arms. "Ethan," she said evenly, "is there any reason this certification has not been completed?" Ethan looked at the reports projected across the wall before answering. "Yes." The room remained quiet. Charlotte waited for an explanation. Instead, Ethan simply added, "The system is not ready." Victor immediately stepped forward. "That statement is exactly the problem. Every independent review confirms the system meets every contractual requirement." Ethan remained seated. "The reports are incomplete." Victor smiled politely. "Or perhaps you simply refuse to accept that nobody is indispensable." Several executives nodded. They had heard similar arguments for weeks. Charlotte looked directly at Ethan. "Then explain exactly what is wrong." Ethan could have mentioned the altered performance values. He could have described the administrator login recorded at 2:13 in the morning. He could have produced the duplicate reports stored safely inside his desk. Instead, he quietly replied, "I cannot approve results I do not trust." Victor spread his hands as though disappointed. There it is again. Personal opinion replacing measurable facts. Charlotte exhaled slowly. The board members had already questioned why Orion remained unfinished. Investors were demanding progress. Every additional delay threatened the largest contract in company history. She believed she was facing a difficult employee unwilling to cooperate at the worst possible moment. "This company cannot operate on personal feelings," she said firmly. Ethan met her eyes without anger. "Neither can it operate on incorrect data." Victor immediately interrupted. "Then perhaps Mr. Walker believes the company should wait indefinitely until he decides everyone else is worthy of his approval." A few uncomfortable laughs escaped around the table before disappearing just as quickly. Charlotte's patience finally reached its limit. "If you believe this project depends entirely on your decision," she said, "then perhaps you should decide whether you still want to work here." Ethan looked down at the framed photograph of Lily beside his notebook. For just a moment, his fingers rested lightly on the edge of the frame. Then he looked back at Charlotte. "All right." He stood, reached beneath the desk, and unfolded the cardboard box he had quietly placed there days earlier. Nobody expected him to continue. He carefully packed Lily's photograph first, then his leather notebook filled with years of engineering sketches. Finally, he removed the ceramic coffee mug painted with tiny blue handprints. The room fell completely silent except for the soft sound of cardboard folding shut. Victor's satisfied expression lasted only a few seconds. Across the table, Diane Foster had reopened the Orion contract after noticing Ethan place the notebook inside the box. Her eyes raced through several legal provisions before suddenly stopping on a single paragraph. She pushed back her chair so quickly that everyone looked toward her. "Charlotte," she said, her voice unsteady for the first time in anyone's memory. If he walks out with that box, Orion does not lose an engineer. Kensington Dynamics loses the legal authority to complete the entire project. No one spoke after Diane Foster finished her sentence. Even the steady rhythm of rain against the conference room windows seemed louder than before. Charlotte Kensington stared at the cardboard box in Ethan Walker's hands as though it contained something far more dangerous than a photograph, a notebook, and a coffee mug. "Explain," she said quietly. Diane swallowed before answering. The Orion Agreement was written around a licensed validation framework developed years ago by Mercer Engineering Solutions before it was absorbed into this company. Ethan is the designated systems architect named in the certification clause. If he resigns before signing the final validation, the agreement automatically pauses for 72 hours while every compliance review begins again. Victor Shaw immediately stepped forward. "That cannot be correct." Diane turned the tablet toward him. "It is in Section 12, Subsection 4. You approved the acquisition paperwork yourself." Victor quickly scanned the screen, but the confidence he carried into the meeting began fading. Charlotte reached for the tablet and read the clause herself. Every word remained exactly where Diane said it would be. The room stayed silent until Charlotte finally looked back at Ethan. "Why did nobody tell me this?" Ethan answered without raising his voice. "Nobody asked." Victor recovered quickly. "This is simply a legal technicality. We will appoint another engineer." Diane shook her head. "Not under this contract. The client specifically required continuity of technical authority after the original system architecture review." Victor frowned. "Then we rewrite the agreement." "The client has already signed it," Diane replied. "Changing it now requires their approval, another federal review, and additional safety testing." Charlotte slowly lowered the tablet. For the first time, she understood why Ethan had never appeared worried during the meeting. He had not been relying on hidden influence. He had simply understood the agreement better than anyone else in the room. Ethan gently lifted the cardboard box. "I should go? Lily's Learning Center closes at 6. Charlotte instinctively took one step forward. "Wait." Ethan stopped, but did not turn around. "I am asking you to stay until we understand this situation." "We already understand it," Ethan answered calmly. "You asked me to choose. I chose." There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet certainty. Victor tried once more. "You cannot seriously walk away from a project you spent years building." Ethan finally looked at him. "I am walking away from a decision, not from my work. There is a difference." He continued toward the conference room door. Several engineers sitting near the back instinctively began standing as if they intended to follow him, but Ethan noticed the movement immediately. He gave each of them a small shake of his head. "Stay," he said gently. "You have families to support too." They slowly sat back down. Charlotte watched the exchange with growing confusion. Loyalty like that could not be demanded. It had to be earned. Ethan opened the conference room door and quietly stepped into the hallway. The automatic door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than every argument that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Almost immediately, Diane's phone rang. She answered, listened for several seconds, then looked toward Charlotte with an expression that erased any remaining hope the situation might be simple. "That was Orion's Federal Compliance Office," she said. "They received notification that the designated systems architect has initiated separation from the company. They are suspending tomorrow's certification review until further notice." Charlotte looked at the empty chair where Ethan had been sitting. The project had not even lost him completely yet, and the first domino had already fallen. Charlotte Kensington did not go home that evening. Long after the executive floor had emptied, she remained alone in the conference room staring at the chair Ethan Walker had occupied only hours earlier. His employee badge still rested on the polished table exactly where he had placed it. Nothing about the room had changed, yet everything felt different. Diane Foster quietly entered carrying a stack of legal documents and placed them beside Charlotte. "I have reviewed every agreement connected to Orion," she said. "The situation is even more serious than we first believed." Charlotte looked up. "Tell me everything." Diane opened the first binder. Ethan was not simply assigned to this project. He designed the original validation framework before Kensington Dynamics acquired Mercer Engineering Solutions. The federal certification recognizes his technical authority because he personally developed the safety architecture that Orion still relies upon. Charlotte closed her eyes for a brief moment. "Victor told me Ethan was refusing to cooperate." Diane answered carefully. The documents tell a different story. She placed several engineering reports across the table. Every rejected certification carried Ethan's signature beside the same handwritten note. Additional verification required. Charlotte read page after page. Every concern Ethan had documented involved measurable safety inconsistencies. None of them mentioned salary, promotion, or personal complaints. Diane continued. He never refused the project. He refused to certify results he believed were inaccurate. At that moment, another notification appeared on Charlotte's tablet. The independent audit team had begun reviewing Orion after the automatic suspension notice. Charlotte opened the message, expecting another procedural update. Instead, she found a preliminary request for every server access log covering the previous 3 months. Victor entered the conference room without knocking. The auditors are overreacting, he said confidently. We should focus on convincing Ethan to return before this becomes public. Charlotte studied him for several seconds before speaking. Did you ever access the Orion validation servers after normal business hours? Victor hesitated for only an instant. Only when operational emergencies required it. Diane quietly slid another document across the table. Our information technology department completed a preliminary review after the suspension notice. One administrator account modified validation records at 2:13 in the morning 12 days ago. Victor immediately crossed his arms. Someone used my credentials. Charlotte looked directly at him. Did they also use your security badge to enter the restricted server room? The confidence slowly disappeared from Victor's face. Before he could answer, Diane opened another folder containing hallway security photographs automatically captured by access control cameras. The timestamp matched the server log exactly. Victor stood alone outside the secure engineering room, carrying a laptop bag. Charlotte felt the memory of her father's words return with painful clarity. Never confuse the person who presents the reports with the person who understands the machines. She had trusted polished presentations instead of the quiet engineer who spent years protecting the company without asking for recognition. Across town, Ethan sat at the kitchen table helping Lily finish her railroad project. The little wooden train moved smoothly across the tracks they had assembled together. Lily looked up with a smile. Dad, sometimes the train stops because one tiny piece is turned the wrong way. Ethan gently adjusted the track until the train continued forward. That happens more often than people realize. At that exact moment, Charlotte stared at the evidence spread across the conference table and finally understood the mistake she had made. The project had never been delayed by the man who insisted on checking every detail. It had been endangered by the one person who wanted everyone to stop looking closely, and she had publicly humiliated the only employee who had been protecting the company from a disaster no one else had even noticed. The following Monday morning, every employee at Kensington Dynamics received an unexpected calendar invitation. Mandatory company meeting. 9 o'clock. Main production auditorium. Rumors spread through every department long before the doors opened. Some believed the Orion contract had been canceled. Others whispered that investors were replacing senior leadership. Charlotte Kensington walked onto the stage alone. There were no promotional videos, no polished presentation slides, and no carefully rehearsed introduction. She stood before hundreds of employees with only a single sheet of paper in her hand. After several quiet seconds, she folded the paper in half and placed it on the podium without reading a single word. I owe every person in this room an apology, she began. A wave of silence moved through the auditorium. Last Thursday, I made a decision based on reports instead of truth. I publicly questioned the integrity of a man who spent years protecting this company while asking for nothing in return. That mistake belongs to me, not to anyone else. Employees exchanged surprised glances. Charlotte continued without attempting to soften her responsibility. Effective immediately, Victor Shaw has been removed from all operational authority pending the completion of an independent investigation. No applause followed. Only quiet attention. Every engineering decision connected to Orion will now undergo independent technical review. No employee will ever again be pressured to approve work they believe is unsafe. Every parent working at Kensington Dynamics will receive flexible scheduling when family responsibilities require it. No manager will measure commitment by the number of hours someone remains inside this building. Several engineers slowly lowered their heads. For years they had waited to hear someone in leadership say those words. Charlotte finished the meeting with one final sentence. Trust is not restored by speeches. It is restored by actions. Mine begin today. She stepped away from the podium and left through the side entrance instead of returning to the executive floor. 40 minutes later, she parked outside a neighborhood elementary school carrying nothing except a small notebook. The annual science fair had already begun. Folding tables filled the school gymnasium, each displaying handmade projects surrounded by proud parents sitting on simple metal chairs. Charlotte quietly walked through the rows until she found Lily Walker standing beside a carefully constructed railroad model controlled by a small programmable sensor system. Ethan noticed Charlotte almost immediately. Their eyes met across the room. Neither smiled. Neither looked away. Charlotte approached slowly and stopped several feet from the display. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said softly. Ethan answered with the same calm voice she remembered from the boardroom. "You are here because of Lily, not because of me." Charlotte nodded. "That is true." She turned toward Lily. "Would you explain how your railroad works?" Lily smiled proudly and spent several minutes describing every sensor, every switch, and every safety checkpoint built into the miniature railway. Charlotte listened carefully without checking her phone once. When Lily finished, Charlotte asked only one question. "What happens if one signal gives the wrong information?" Lily smiled and gently pointed toward a small safety gate. "The train stops until somebody finds the real problem. Dad says pretending everything is fine never makes anything safer." Charlotte looked at Ethan. He said nothing. He did not need to. The lesson reached her more clearly than any executive report ever had. As families slowly left the gymnasium that afternoon, Charlotte quietly stayed behind to help fold tables and stack empty chairs with other parents. She never mentioned Orion. She never asked Ethan to return. She understood that rebuilding trust would not begin inside a boardroom. It would begin by keeping small promises in ordinary places, one quiet action at a time. 3 months passed before Ethan Walker walked through the doors of Kensington Dynamics again. This time, he did not carry an employee badge. He carried only the same worn leather notebook that had traveled with him for years. The company had changed during his absence. Independent engineering reviews had become standard practice. Safety certifications required multiple technical approvals instead of executive pressure. Flexible scheduling for parents had been adopted across every department. The culture Charlotte Kensington promised to rebuild had begun changing one decision at a time. Ethan did not return as an employee. He accepted a contract as an independent technical advisor with one condition written into the agreement before he signed it. No engineer could ever again be disciplined for delaying certification when legitimate safety concerns existed. Charlotte accepted every condition without negotiation. She had finally learned that trust could not be purchased. It had to be protected. The Orion project successfully completed its independent audit several weeks later. Every altered record had been corrected. Every validation test had been repeated from the beginning. Federal inspectors approved the system only after confirming every safeguard Ethan originally requested. The announcement generated headlines celebrating Kensington Dynamics for its renewed commitment to engineering integrity, but inside the company, everyone knew the truth. The project had not been saved by rushing forward. It had been saved because one quiet father refused to approve something he knew was not ready. Victor Shaw officially resigned before the independent investigation concluded. Charlotte never spoke publicly about him again. Instead, she focused every leadership meeting on a single question. What facts are we missing? It became the first agenda item in every executive review. Months later, during another neighborhood science fair, Charlotte arrived 15 minutes early carrying a homemade apple pie instead of expensive gifts. She helped parents arrange folding tables before the students entered the gymnasium. Lily noticed her first and smiled. "Miss Kensington, you came back." Charlotte smiled warmly. "I said I would." Ethan watched the exchange from across the room without interrupting. Promises, he believed, revealed character far more clearly than apologies. After the awards ceremony, Lily carefully packed her newest robotics project into a storage box before looking at both adults. "Would either of you like pizza?" she asked hopefully. Ethan laughed softly. "That sounds like an excellent idea." Charlotte looked toward him, waiting for his answer rather than assuming one. After a brief moment, he nodded. "There is a small family place about 5 minutes from here." The restaurant was simple, filled with families enjoying ordinary Friday evenings. Nobody recognized the billionaire seated in a corner booth sharing slices of pepperoni pizza and listening as an 8-year-old enthusiastically explained how she wanted to become an engineer one day. Charlotte asked questions. Ethan quietly listened. Lily smiled more than she talked. When dinner ended, Charlotte reached for her wallet. Ethan gently stopped her. "Tonight is my turn." She accepted his answer without argument because respect sometimes meant allowing another person to give instead of always giving yourself. Outside, the evening air carried the cool breeze of early autumn. Lily reached for Ethan's hand with one hand and looked toward Charlotte with the other. "Thank you for coming, Miss Kensington." Charlotte smiled. "Thank you for inviting me." As they walked toward the parking lot together, Ethan glanced at the city skyline glowing in the distance. He had not become wealthier by leaving the company. Charlotte had not become a better leader because she owned more businesses. They had both changed because they finally understood the same quiet truth. Success built on pride eventually collapses under its own weight, but success built on honesty, responsibility, and promises faithfully kept becomes strong enough to support everyone who depends on it. And sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone else wrong. It is finding the courage to keep doing what is right, even when nobody is applauding.